The silence of a winter forest is a peculiar thing. It doesn't feel like absence. It feels like presence, something vast and patient, watching. In February 1978, that silence swallowed 5 men whole. Picture this. A Mercury Montego, cream-colored and unremarkable, sits abandoned on a narrow mountain road in the Plumas National Forest. Snow has begun to gather on its hood. The engine is cold now, but when the Forest Service finds it, they discover something that makes no sense. The car isn't broken down. The battery holds a charge. The engine turns over smoothly when they try the ignition. It's simply stuck in a snowbank, not buried, just wedged. 2 men could have pushed it free in minutes. Inside, the scene suggests an interrupted journey. A bag of hostess snacks sits on the passenger seat, half-eaten. A road map lies unfolded. The windows are rolled up. Everything is ordinary except for one detail. The keys are missing. When investigators walk the perimeter, their boots crunching through the snow, they find something else. Tracks. Multiple sets of footprints leading away from the vehicle, heading north, deeper into the forest, away from civilization. The prints are clear enough to count. 5 people, all of them walking in the same direction into the dark throat of the wilderness. Months later, when the spring thaw finally comes and investigators open the door of an isolated forestry trailer 19 miles into that darkness, they find a horror that defies logic. A man dead in a bed, wrapped in 8 sheets like a corpse prepared for burial. His body has wasted to almost nothing. The autopsy will determine he lost between 80 and 100 pounds before he died. Starvation. Hypothermia. But here's what breaks the rational mind. The trailer is stocked with supplies. Heavy winter coats hang on hooks. Matches sit in a drawer. Paperback books could have served as kindling. Just outside, in a storage shed, there are enough freeze-dried military rations to feed all 5 men for a year. Only 36 meals have been eaten. The rest remain sealed, untouched. On a small table near the bed, investigators find a wristwatch. Gold-banded. Expensive. It belongs to none of the missing men. What happened on that mountain road? What made 5 friends abandon a working vehicle and walk nearly 20 miles through freezing darkness? What kind of terror or madness could drive men to starve inside a cabin full of food? To understand the mystery, you have to understand the men. Yuba City, California, sits in the agricultural heart of the state, a modest community where everyone knows their neighbors and life follows predictable rhythms. In 1978, 5 young men from Yuba City formed an unlikely but close-knit group. They called themselves a team, and in many ways they were. All of them played on a local basketball squad organized for people with mild intellectual disabilities. They weren't children. They ranged in age from 24 to 32. Most held jobs. Most had served in the military. They navigated the world with varying degrees of support, but they were competent, functional, and deeply loyal to one another. Ted Weiher, 55 pounds overweight and gentle-natured, worked as a janitor and lived with his mother. Friends described him as sweet-tempered and reliable. Jack Madruga owned the Mercury Montego. He was the most independent of the group, employed steadily, known for his mechanical aptitude. If the car had broken down, he would have known. Bill Sterling, Army veteran, had a sharp wit and a love of basketball that bordered on obsession. Jack Hewitt, quiet and thoughtful, rarely spoke but never missed a game. And then there was Gary Mathias, 35 years old, former Army sergeant, diagnosed with schizophrenia but stable on medication. Gary was the sharpest of the 5, the most worldly. He'd served in Germany. He understood consequences. He also knew the danger of missing his medication, knew the symptoms of a psychotic break. And according to his family, he was meticulous about his prescriptions. On February 24, 1978, the 5 men drove to Chico, about 50 miles from Yuba City, to watch a college basketball game. It was a Friday night. They'd been looking forward to it all week. Their own team had a playoff game scheduled for the next day, and they were excited, energized. Witnesses at the game remembered seeing them. They seemed happy, normal. They bought snacks. They watched the game. They left. The drive home should have taken an hour. Highway 70, straight south, familiar roads. But something happened. Instead of heading home, the Mercury turned east, away from the valley, up into the mountains, up a road called Oroville-Quincy Highway, a narrow, winding route that climbs into the Sierra Nevada wilderness. In February, that road is treacherous. Snow, ice, darkness. It's not a shortcut. It's not scenic. It leads nowhere they needed to go. At some point, the car turned onto an even smaller road, a Forest Service route barely maintained, the kind of road you only take if you know exactly where you're going or if you're running from something. And then they stopped, or the car stopped, and 5 men stepped out into the frozen night and began walking. Question isn't just what happened to them. The question is, what did they see? The families realized something was wrong by Saturday morning. The 5 men never came home. They missed their playoff game, something unthinkable for this group. Their basketball was sacred, a ritual that structured their weeks, gave them purpose and identity. Ted Weiher's mother, Imogen, called the police immediately. Her son never stayed out overnight. Never. The others were the same. Reliable, predictable, men of routine. The police began with the logical steps: hospitals, accident reports, known hangouts. Nothing. By Sunday, the search expanded. Local volunteers combed the areas between Chico and Yuba City. The Mercury Montego's license plate went out over the wire. Days passed. Then a week. The families held prayer vigils. Local news ran their photographs. 5 young men, smiling in their basketball jerseys, vanished without explanation. The car was found on March 3rd, 8 days after the disappearance. A Forest Service employee doing routine winter patrols spotted it on a mountain road 50 miles from where the men should have been. The location made no sense. Rogers Cow Camp Road at an elevation of 4,400 feet, deep in the Plumas National Forest. The nearest town was Quincy, and even that was miles away through treacherous terrain. When the officer approached the vehicle, he found it locked. No sign of damage, no sign of struggle. He called it in, and within hours, a full investigation team arrived. What they discovered defied every rational explanation. The car sat nose forward in a snowbank on the side of the narrow road, not buried, not disabled, simply stuck. The front wheels had pushed into the snow, probably spinning, but the vehicle wasn't high-centered. It wasn't damaged. When they examined it, they found the gas tank still had fuel. The battery held a charge. The engine started on the first try. A mechanic later testified that 2 people could have rocked the car free in less than 5 minutes. Even one person, with some effort, could have managed it. Jack Madruga knew cars. He'd been maintaining vehicles for years. The idea that he would abandon a working car rather than spend a few minutes freeing, it made no sense. Inside, investigators cataloged the contents with growing unease. The half-eaten bag of snacks, wrappers on the floor, the map, a few personal items, but no wallets, no identification, no keys. The doors had been locked from the outside, which meant someone had the keys when they left. Then they found the tracks, footprints in the snow leading away from the passenger side of the vehicle. North. Deeper into the forest, away from any civilization, away from the direction they'd come. The tracks were clear enough to analyze. 5 distinct sets, all wearing different shoes, all heading in the same direction. Not scattered as if people had panicked and run in different directions. Together. A group moving with apparent purpose into the wilderness. The search began immediately, but February in the high Sierras is merciless. Snow continued to fall. Temperatures at night dropped below freezing. Search and rescue teams fanned out from the car, following the footprints as far as they could, but the trail grew confused, obscured by fresh snowfall and the dense forest. Helicopters swept overhead. Tracking dogs were brought in but lost the scent in the snow. Dozens of volunteers joined law enforcement, forming search lines, calling out names into the vast silence of the forest. They found nothing. No bodies, no abandoned clothing, no signs of a camp or shelter. It was as if the 5 men had simply dissolved into the winter landscape. Then Joseph Scons came forward. Scons was a 55-year-old Yuba City resident who'd been traveling through the same area on the night of February 24th. He'd been driving up the mountain to visit his family's trailer when he experienced a heart attack. His car stalled on Rogers Cow Camp Road, the same road where the Mercury would later be found. He managed to pull over, and there he sat, in pain in the dark, in his disabled vehicle, trying to decide whether to wait for help or risk walking. What he told police sent a chill through the investigation. Around midnight, he saw headlights approaching. A vehicle came up the road and stopped somewhere near his position. He couldn't see exactly where because of the curve in the road and the darkness. He heard a car engine running for a while, then silence. Then he heard voices, men's voices, talking. Not shouting, not panic, just conversing in the dark. Skans, suffering and frightened, called out for help. He needed assistance. He needed someone to know he was there. The voices stopped. Then he heard movement. Footsteps in the snow. But no one came to help him. Instead, he saw shadows in the darkness, people moving past his car, heading uphill into the forest. He called out again. The figures didn't respond. They just kept walking. He saw what appeared to be a group of men, maybe 4 or 5, trudging through the snow, ignoring his cries, moving away from the road. Skans, in pain and growing delirious, watched them disappear into the trees. He saw lights, flashlights, he thought, or maybe headlamps, bobbing in the darkness, getting farther away. Then nothing. He spent the night in his car, drifting in and out of consciousness. By morning, other travelers found him and got him to a hospital. He nearly died. When he recovered enough to speak, he mentioned the strange encounter to his family, but he didn't connect it to the missing men until he saw their faces on the news. The timeline matched perfectly. The location matched. Skans had seen them. He'd seen the 5 men walking into the forest, heard them speaking, watched them ignore his desperate calls for help and continue into the darkness. The question became, what were they walking toward? Or what were they walking away from? The winter held its secrets close. Through March and into April, the snow remained too deep for thorough searching. The families waited in anguish. Imogen Wyher couldn't sleep. She kept her son's room exactly as he'd left it, his basketball jersey folded on the chair. The mothers of the other men gathered at each other's homes, making coffee, saying prayers, asking the same unanswerable questions. What could make 5 grown men walk into a frozen forest in the middle of the night? Theories multiplied. Perhaps they'd seen something on the road, an accident, someone who needed help, and had gone to investigate. Perhaps they'd been chased by someone, threatened, forced up the mountain. Perhaps the car had broken down initially and they'd decided to walk for help, not realizing how far they were from civilization. But none of these theories explained Joseph Skans. They'd walked past a man calling for help, a man in obvious distress. Why ignore him? Why keep walking? The local sheriff's department consulted with psychiatric professionals. Could Gary Mathias have had a psychotic episode? Could he have somehow convinced the others to follow him into the wilderness? His family insisted he'd been stable, taking his medication regularly, showing no signs of distress. And the others, they weren't easily led. They were friends, yes, but they were also individuals with their own judgment. The idea that all 5 would follow one man into certain death seemed implausible. As the snow began its slow retreat in late April, the search intensified. Volunteers returned to the forest. Search and rescue teams plotted grids, systematically covering the area around the abandoned Mercury. The families offered rewards. Psychics called in with visions. None of it led anywhere. Then, on June 4th, nearly 4 months after the disappearance, a motorcyclist exploring Forest Service roads noticed something odd. A trailer. A weathered Forestry Service camp trailer sitting in a clearing, far from any maintained road. He might have passed it by. These old trailers dotted remote areas, used seasonally by forest workers, except the door was ajar. He approached and looked inside. What he saw made him turn and ride immediately for the nearest ranger station. The trailer sat approximately 19.5 miles from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. To reach it on foot would have required walking through the night, through snow, at elevation, in freezing temperatures. The route involved no trails, no clear paths, just wilderness. When investigators arrived and entered the trailer, they found themselves in a scene that rewrote everything they thought they understood about the case. The interior was small but functional. 2 bunk beds, a table, storage cabinets, a propane heater. Everything a forestry worker might need for an extended stay in a remote location. On one of the beds lay a body, so desiccated and wasted it was initially difficult to identify. The remains were wrapped in 8 separate sheets, layered carefully, almost ceremonially. The man had been tall once. The autopsy would identify him as Ted Wyher, the gentle giant who loved basketball and lived with his mother. Ted had weighed over 200 pounds when he disappeared. His remains weighed less than 100. He'd lost half his body weight. The medical examiner's report was unequivocal: starvation and hypothermia. He'd lived in that trailer for weeks, possibly months, slowly dying. But here's what made investigators stand in that small space, struggling to process what they were seeing. The trailer was stocked with supplies. The propane heater worked. They tested it. Heavy winter coats hung on hooks near the door, Forest Service gear, insulated and weatherproof. In the drawers, they found matches, candles. In the small bookshelf, paperback books that could have been torn apart and used as kindling. The trailer even had windows with intact glass, keeping out the worst of the cold. Ted Weiher had frozen to death in a shelter that could have kept him warm. Outside, attached to the trailer, stood a storage shed. When they opened it, they found military rations, cases of them. Sea rations and freeze-dried meals, enough to feed a large crew for months. The investigators counted, enough food to sustain all 5 men for over a year. Only 36 rations had been opened. The cans sat in a neat pile near the shed. Someone had eaten them methodically, then stopped. The rest remained untouched. Inside the trailer, on the small table, they found that gold wristwatch. Expensive. Engraved with a name that didn't match any of the 5 men. It had stopped at a specific time, the hands frozen in place. No one ever determined who it belonged to or how it came to be there. They found a pair of leather shoes under the bed. Size 11. Forest Service issue. They didn't belong to Ted Weiher. Through process of elimination, investigators determined they belonged to Gary Mathias, the former Army sergeant, the one who understood survival, who'd been trained for crisis situations. Gary's shoes were there, but Gary was not. The crime scene, because that's what it had become, even though no crime could be definitively named, suggested a timeline that made no sense. Ted Weiher had clearly been the last survivor. He'd lived long enough to lose catastrophic amounts of weight. The open rations suggested he'd eaten something, at least initially. But then he'd stopped. He'd wrapped himself in sheets and waited to die. Had he been injured? The autopsy found no major trauma. Had he been too weak to open the cans? But he'd managed earlier. Had something stopped him from accessing the food? But the shed was right outside, unlocked. The investigators photographed everything. They documented the scene with meticulous care, knowing that somewhere in these details was an answer, a key to understanding what had happened in this remote clearing. As they worked, one of them noticed something else. On the wall near Ted's bed, scratched into the wood paneling, were marks, tally marks. Someone had been counting days. There were 81 of them. 81 days. Ted Weiher had survived for nearly 3 months in that trailer, marking time on the wall, slowly starving while surrounded by food he never touched. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a man who stumbled into shelter and quickly succumbed to the elements. This was a prolonged dying, a conscious experience of deterioration. The discovery of Ted's body galvanized the search. If one man had made it 19 miles into the forest, the others had to be somewhere in the same area. Teams fanned out from the trailer, searching in expanding circles, looking for any trace of the remaining 4 men. They didn't have to look far. Within days, searchers found clothing, a leather boot, then bones. The spring runoff and 4 months of exposure to predators and weather had scattered the remains, but the pattern began to emerge. Bill Sterling's remains were found first, about a mile from the trailer, down a steep embankment. His body had been ravaged by scavengers, but the location suggested he might have been trying to climb up to the trailer site. Or perhaps he'd fallen. The coroner couldn't determine a definitive cause of death, but hypothermia remained the most likely explanation. Jack Madruga was found near Sterling, the man who'd owned the car, who'd understood mechanics, who'd been the group's navigator. His remains told the same story: exposure, hypothermia, the mountain taking its toll. Jack Hewitt's partial remains were discovered farther away, higher up the mountain slope. Less of him was recovered. The elements and animals had done their work over the long winter. 3 bodies accounted for. Ted in the trailer. Gary Mathias still missing. The autopsies provided few answers but many more questions. None of the men showed signs of violent trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab marks, no evidence of a physical attack. The preliminary reports suggested they'd all died from exposure to the elements, though Ted's starvation complicated his case. Toxicology screens came back clean. No drugs, No alcohol. Gary Mathias's family confirmed he'd had his prescriptions filled the week before the disappearance, and his medication wasn't found in the trailer or with any of the remains. If he'd stopped taking it, withdrawal could have induced a psychotic episode. But that didn't explain why the others would follow him. And it didn't explain the deliberate walk into the forest, the 19-mile journey through darkness and snow. Investigators reconstructed the timeline as best they could. The men had left Chico around 10 p.m. after the basketball game. Joseph Scons encountered them around midnight on Rogers Cow Camp Road. They'd walked away from the Mercury, walked past Scons, and continued into the forest. Sometime in those dark hours, they traveled 19.5 miles through snow-covered wilderness with no clear trail, at elevation, in freezing temperatures, to reach the trailer. That journey alone was remarkable. These weren't experienced outdoorsmen. They weren't equipped with proper gear. They were wearing the clothes they'd worn to a basketball game, light jackets, casual shoes. Ted Weiher had been in loafers, yet somehow they'd made it to that trailer. Why had they split up? The evidence suggested that Sterling, Madruga, and Hewitt never made it inside the trailer, or if they did, they left and died trying to get back down the mountain. But Ted had stayed. And Gary, if his shoes were any indication, had been there too. Had there been an argument? A disagreement about what to do next? Had some of them wanted to stay in the shelter while others tried to hike out for help? The families grasped for explanations. Imogen Weiher, looking at the photographs of the trailer interior that the police reluctantly shared, couldn't understand why her son hadn't used the heater, hadn't eaten the food. Ted wasn't self-destructive. He loved life. He loved basketball. He'd been excited about the playoff game. What could have changed so drastically in a few hours? The Forest Service provided additional context. The trailer was part of a seasonal camp, locked and unused during winter months. Somehow the men had gotten inside. The door showed signs of forced entry, though not violent. Perhaps they'd shouldered it open or found it already compromised by weather. The maps told another story. To reach that trailer from where the car was abandoned required walking generally northeast, climbing in elevation, navigating around natural obstacles, crossing a creek bed. In daylight, with a map and compass, it would be challenging. In darkness, in winter, it should have been impossible, yet they'd made it. All 5 of them, apparently together, had found their way to this remote shelter. One theory emerged among the investigators. Perhaps they'd seen lights. Forest Service personnel sometimes used these trailers. Maybe someone had been there with a generator with lanterns. Maybe the men had seen those lights from the road and had walked toward them, seeking help or warmth. But when they'd arrived, whoever had been there was gone, leaving only the trailer and its supplies. This theory had problems, though. No Forest Service worker reported being in the area that weekend. No generator was found. No signs of recent occupation before the men arrived. And it didn't explain the locked storage shed full of food that Ted apparently never accessed, despite living in the trailer for nearly 3 months. The gold watch haunted investigators. Whose was it? Why was it there? They ran the engraving through databases, contacted watch manufacturers, followed every lead. Nothing connected it to anyone involved in the case. It sat in the evidence room, a tangible piece of the mystery that refused to fit into any coherent narrative. As spring turned to summer, the searches for Gary Mathias continued. Dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the forest. Volunteers hiked every trail, checked every ravine. Gary had simply vanished. No body, no bones, no trace. His family held out hope. Maybe he'd survived. Maybe he'd wandered away confused and was living somewhere, unable to remember who he was. Maybe someone had found him and taken him in. These hopes grew thinner as weeks became months, but they never quite disappeared. The investigation shifted from rescue to analysis. What had happened on that mountain? The official investigation closed in late 1978, though it never truly ended in the minds of those who studied it. The Yuba County Sheriff's Department filed its reports. The autopsies were completed. The evidence was cataloged and stored, but the fundamental question remained unanswered. Why? Investigators interviewed everyone who'd been at the basketball game in Chico. No one reported any altercations. No one saw the men leave with anyone else or noticed them being followed. They'd simply watched the game, bought snacks, and left. Routine. Unremarkable. The theories that emerged in the aftermath were numerous, each attempting to impose logic on the illogical. The first theory suggested a simple wrong turn followed by panic. Perhaps Jack Madruga, driving, had missed a turnoff in the dark. Once they realized they were on the wrong road, perhaps they tried to turn around and gotten the car stuck. Then, disoriented and frightened, they'd made the fatal decision to walk for help instead of staying with the vehicle. This theory had the virtue of simplicity, but it didn't explain the 19-mile journey to the trailer, the deliberate walk past Joseph Scones, or Ted Weiher's bizarre behavior inside the shelter. The second theory involved foul play. Perhaps they'd encountered someone on the road, someone dangerous. Perhaps they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. Perhaps they'd been chased up the mountain, forced to abandon their car, and then pursued through the forest. This explained their apparent urgency, their refusal to help Scones, their decision to keep moving. But it didn't explain the lack of physical trauma on any of the bodies. It didn't explain why no one heard gunshots or saw evidence of another vehicle. And it didn't explain the slow starvation in a trailer full of food. The third theory centered on Gary Mathias and his mental health. Perhaps he'd experienced a psychotic break, a sudden departure from reality. Perhaps he'd convinced the others that they were in danger, that they needed to run, that they couldn't trust anyone. The others, knowing Gary and trusting him, might have followed. This explained the group cohesion, the apparent purpose in their movements. But Gary's family maintained he'd been stable. His medication was current. And even in a psychotic state, would all 5 men have marched 19 miles through snow without a single one breaking away? A forensic psychiatrist consulted on the case proposed something more subtle: shared delusion. Under extreme stress, in the dark, in the cold, with one member potentially experiencing a break from reality, the others might have gradually adopted his worldview. Folie à plusieurs, a madness shared by several. It's rare, but documented. A charismatic or authoritative figure convinces others of a false reality, and that false reality becomes their operating truth. What false reality? What were they running from? What did they think they saw? The more investigators dug into the evidence, the more the case seemed to resist explanation. Every answer created new questions. Why did Ted Weiher survive so long in the trailer only to starve surrounded by food? One medical expert suggested a possibility that haunted everyone who heard it. Perhaps Ted was waiting. Perhaps he believed the others were coming back. Perhaps he thought Gary Mathias had gone for help and would return. So he rationed what little food he allowed himself. He marked the days on the wall and he waited, and waited, until his body simply couldn't wait anymore. The tally marks: 81 days of hope. 81 days of expecting rescue that never came. Gary Mathias was never found. Years passed, then decades. Searches resumed periodically when new leads emerged: a hiker reporting bones, a hunter finding a torn piece of cloth. Each time the evidence led nowhere. Gary had vanished more completely than seemed possible. Some investigators believed he might have fallen into a ravine or crevasse that remained hidden. Others thought he might have traveled farther than anyone imagined, dying in some remote location where his remains would never be discovered. His shoes in the trailer suggested he'd been there. But why would he leave his shoes behind? Why would he walk out into the snow in socks or barefoot, unless he'd taken them off because he was overheating? A symptom of severe hypothermia where victims paradoxically feel burning hot and shed their clothing. Paradoxical undressing, it's called. The final confusion before death. The families never received the closure they needed. Imogen Weiher died in 1992, still asking why. The other mothers followed over the years, carrying their questions to graves. The case appeared in magazines, on television documentaries, in true crime podcasts. Each retelling examined the evidence from new angles, proposed new theories, but none could definitively solve the mystery. What remains is this: 5 friends went to a basketball game on a February night in 1978. They should have driven home in an hour. Instead, they turned toward the mountains and drove into darkness. They abandoned a working car. They walked past a man calling for help. They traveled 19 miles through winter wilderness to find a shelter they couldn't have known was there. 4 of them died from exposure. 1 survived for months in a stock trailer before starving to death, and 1 vanished without leaving a trace. The forest keeps its secrets. The Plumas National Forest still stands, vast and silent, its snow still falling each winter, covering the landscape in white. Hikers occasionally visit the area where the trailer once stood. It's been removed now, taken away as evidence, then eventually disposed of. But the location remains, marked on maps used by those who study unsolved mysteries. On quiet winter nights, when the snow is falling and the temperature drops, you can stand in that clearing and feel the weight of unanswered questions. You can imagine 5 men arriving here in the dark, cold and frightened, seeking shelter from something, or someone, that may have existed only in their minds. The Yuba County Five. The American Dyatlov Pass. A mystery that reminds us how fragile the human mind becomes under stress, how quickly the familiar can become alien, how easily we can lose our way in the dark, and how the silence of a winter forest can swallow people whole, leaving behind only questions that echo through the years, unanswered and unanswerable.